My name is Linda Lees. I'm Director of Cultural Programming for TEFAF New York. I am so happy to have you here for this exciting conversation. I think there will be some agreement, and I think there will be some disagreement on some issues, which is exactly what we want. We will have a Q&A at the end, so keep that in mind. I also want to let you know that this is being live streamed, so people can see it now who are not here, and it will be on Facebook for a while, and then up on the TEFAF website. And all of the public programs, if you happen to have missed something you wanted to see, are also on the website. And, the ones this time are on Facebook, but they will also all be on the website. So since fall of 2016, we have videos of all our programs, and it's really worthwhile going to have a look at them. This, of course, is such an important conversation, I don't have to tell you, and that's why you're here. So I'm going to get down to it quickly to introduce our moderator, Barry Bergdahl, who's Professor of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia University and Curator in the Department of Architecture and Design at the Museum of Modern Art.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. We're going to be three people speaking with slides because three of us are art historians and we're afraid to leave the house without images. And one person who has no slides because he's used to being in public and dealing with tough public issues as a person who's going to take us from the past into the present and the future in his role of many years as a public policy maker. So let me quickly introduce the panelists, starting with, I've just been introduced, but next to me is Harriet Senni. She's the director of the MA program in art history at City College and also a professor at CUNY Graduate Center. But mostly she is here because she is one of the world's specialists on these complex issues of public art and memorials, remembering and forgetting, because forgetting is always the counterpart of remembering, or trying to make people remember, or trying to make people forget. I think that's what we're going to be debating this morning. She's the author of a wonderful book with the great title, Memorials to Shattered Myths, Vietnam to 9/11. So that obviously takes us to a key site in New York. Next to her is Michele Bogart. She's a professor of art history at State University of New York at Stony Brook. But despite that Long Island location, she is one of the great specialists on what some have called the period of statue mania, the period when, of course, public parks on all continents, but very dramatically in America and in New York, were filled with statues to great dignitaries, many of whose identities were quickly forgotten despite being put in bronze and have been rediscovered as contentious individuals. So I think she's going to take us to that with her now canonic book, but many others since then. But I think I should cite Public Sculpture and the Civic Ideal in New York City, 1890 to 1930. And then at the other end of the panel, bookending our two specialists, is Adrian Benepe. He's currently Senior Vice President Director of the City Park Development for the Trust for Public Land, but in the Bloomberg administration, he was our much beloved Parks Commissioner. So he is the person who not only helped the recent renaissance of parks, but I think was present when many of the debates that we'll be talking about this morning first really burst onto the scene very prominently. We're in another period of enormous contention over public monuments that has as much to do, or maybe even more to do, with removing them than erecting them. So I'm not a historian of this period, nor a historian of New York City. I just wanted to maybe set up a few issues with some images to remind us that we don't need to wait for the early 21st century for this issue. We only have an hour, so I'm not going back to obelisks in their initial installation, although we're going to see some coming up, because we know that in Pharaonic Egypt it was a very frequent practice for a new pharaoh to begin to obliterate the hieroglyphs that made any mention of the name, the life, or in particular the deeds of a previous pharaoh. So the idea of erasing and trying to manipulate the historical record or manipulate the will of a previous ruler, we know all about that in the daily newspapers right now, is actually an ancient one. It certainly is intensified in moments of political revolution or enormous political strife, and therefore I think very appropriate to get together at a moment when we are talking about the country divided as perhaps it has not been since the Civil War. But I'm not going to take you to the Soviet Union, but just briefly to my own area of expertise, which is late 18th century and early 19th century Paris. What you see on the screen is the three images of what we now know as the Pantheon in Paris, a kind of conception that is there with the invention of the public monument. This was to be a temple to the idea of great men, the creation of, in a certain sense, a set of secular saints, because the Pantheon was created by transforming a building that had been built as a church with a vow of Louis XV to honor the patron saint of Paris. It was secularized, confiscated, some would say, under the French Revolution, and converted into this new idea of a monument to great men. It was not going to remain a stable monument. It would change back and forth between church and secular uses 7 times before it finally, with the great state funeral of Victor Hugo, remained the Pantheon to this day. But as you can see, it was therefore a building that throughout the 19th century was continuously in renovation with major architectural changes. But in particular, what you see here is the pediment constantly disappearing from view and reappearing either as with a cross on it in the center or with what we see today, David d'Angers' great monument to the birth of the Republic through Enlightenment figures and through the figures of the Napoleonic armies. That was a public monument that was considered so politically dangerous as it was being completed that for several years the state kept the scaffolding in place, fearful of the consequences of allowing that pediment to come into view. So we mustn't imagine that we are the first moment in modern culture in which the seemingly noble acts of creating monuments to generally held values, in fact, run into contestation. And we could, of course, look at any number of places in Paris that are very well known to us. This is not Philadelphia on the top left, but rather the inspiration for the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, what is today's Place de la Concorde. If it talks about concord or agreement, it's in fact a place that's been had a history of strife and contestation, not to forget about bloodshed with the guillotine. And you see in the center a place that was originally created as an urban frame for a great statue of Louis XV. You see the revolutionaries taking it down in the early moments of 1790, removing royal symbols from Paris with the events of 1789 and on in the French Revolution. Now, of course, this had been preceded, Michele will probably immediately protest, by toppling of figures of the monarch in the young American Republic. So this toppling of statues, a kind of early act of performance art, is also something of long standing. Interestingly, the Place de la Concorde, ultimately, this is a very light slide from what I wanted a 19th century photograph, has the gift of the Pasha of Egypt, who also gave the obelisk to Central Park. The obelisk that was put in place under the July monarchy, under the constitutional monarchy of Louis Philippe. On its base is recorded the act of erecting it as a monument to technical expertise. And the King Louis Philippe said, finally, maybe we have a monument that will stay here and will not need to be taken down again because nobody knows what it means. So the idea of a meaningless monument as the only one that can possibly occupy public space is what I wanted to leave you with as we turn to people much more versed. There it is going up, not down, as we turned, and of course, a connection between what I've just told you and New York. I don't know if the obelisk is a meaningless monument. It's sometimes a neglected monument. And recently, attention has, of course, turned to whether or not Columbus should remain in Columbus Circle. But I'll leave that to people much more qualified than I to speak and turn the clicker and the screen and the word over to Michele Bogart.
Good morning. I'll just say the obelisk is not no longer neglected because it just recently, in the last few years, underwent a fantastic conservation overhaul, and it looks fantastic, so go see it. Now, I've been asked to speak about the problem of monuments, and I will speak to the problem of monuments, focusing on New York City. First, by pointing out that framing the problem this way is a problem because most monuments have not been a problem until now. Well, true. Back in July 1776, the Sons of Liberty, energized by hearing read the Declaration of Independence, tore down the statue of George III that stood in Bowling Green, thus highlighting the potential vicissitudes of monuments to figures of power and establishing a precedent for tearing down unpalatable symbols of political authority. But very little happened for many, many years after this. And if anything, the problem of monuments was not the drive to remove them, but rather the lack of an impulse to erect them. There wasn't a strong constituency of patrons or drive to commission monuments until the post-Civil War period, when there was motivation to commemorate the deaths of ordinary soldiers, like the 7th Regiment soldiers. And then subsequently, individual heroes who represented in some way ideals of national origins or national unity. Although every monument had its own unique and sometimes troubled genesis, it wasn't until Frederick McMoney's statue of civic virtue, conceived in 1909 but not completed until 1922, that there was any significant public outcry or effort to have a permanent monument removed. Civic virtue is an oddball but instructive case with a cautionary tale. Designed for New York City Hall Park, but moved by Parks Commissioner Robert Moses to Queensborough Hall, or next to Queensborough Hall, in 1941, when the park was reconstructed. Civic virtue was a unique, mayorally sponsored celebration of good government, rendered allegorically, as I'm sure is evident to attendees of TEFAF would know this, that it's allegorical. From the get-go, however, first in 1922, then in 1987, then 1997, and then 2007, more people read the imagery literally as hostile to women. The interpretation sort of misread the artist's original intentions, though, and to some extent the imagery itself. People didn't look. They drew conclusions. Myths were propagated. At the same time, my study, lots of study, of the statue and then the artist's biography led me to conclude that there were potential psychological reasons that might have prompted McMoney's to render the subject unwittingly in problematic ways. The monument ended up embodying both complex urban and gender politics and many contradictions bound up with each of its respective sites. The one in Queens, here I might note, involved former Congressman Anthony Weiner. In the end, the city moved civic virtue to Greenwood Cemetery in order to preserve it, irrevocably altering its significance on the basis of a few politicians' myopic but rigid points of view about it. Civic virtue is a fascinating case study in modern monument controversy. Its peculiar circumstances could have inspired on-site education, not denial or removal. Its history has been especially complicated, but all of our monument histories are in fact complex. It's the process rather than merely, say, issues of quality or an objectionable subject that makes them so and that reveal their importance. The processes of historical monument patronage, production, and reception have posed challenges by their very nature. They've involved negotiation, accommodation, conflict, and power play among multiple parties with different personal and professional agendas, and have often unfolded over a lengthy period of time. Thus, the monuments we have in New York City, far from being problems, are, in my view, success stories. They tell us much about the rich and convoluted history of the city, because they are about the people of this city as much as they are about the subjects that the statues represent, contested though some of those subjects may be in the present day. The subject matter of the works now deemed objectionable, be it civic virtue or Christopher Columbus, is only one aspect of their significance. We need not regard those works as celebrations or validations of evil ideals or people, say as determined by us today, but rather constructively as historical urban artifacts that still have an important educational and civic role to play, if we could only be open-minded enough to try to understand how to do so.
I think we'll pass directly to Harriet. We'll hear all four presentations and then begin our responses and questions. And I hope while you're listening, you're jotting down things you want to either pose a query about or, in fact, open a discussion about. Harriet.
Good morning. I thought it might be helpful to talk a little bit about my experience last year as a member of the, I have to read the title every time, excuse me, the Mayoral Advisory Commission on City Art, Monuments, and Markers. So this commission was charged with, I'm quoting here, advising the mayor on issues surrounding public art and historic monuments and markers on city-owned property. That city-owned property is an important thing to remember. If it's not on city-owned property, city has no jurisdiction. By the end of the year, the commission, this was the initial charge, will propose non-binding guidelines on how the city should address monuments seen as inconsistent with the values of New York City. We might really want to talk about what those could possibly be that we all share. I want to emphasize that this was an advisory committee. We couldn't make a regulation, and that what we did was we made a recommendation that went to the mayor, then the agency in charge, so if it was on Parks property, it would go to Parks, a community board meeting, and a public design commission hearing. So it was a long-step process. And the way this commission worked was we began by defining some guiding principles, starting with this notion of shared values. And the first value was inclusion. The capacity for all New Yorkers to feel welcome in New York City's public spaces and have a voice in the public processes by which monuments and markers are included in such spaces. Then the second one, historical understanding, speaks to some of the remarks Michele just made. A respect for and a commitment to in-depth and nuanced histories, acknowledging multiple perspectives, histories that have not been privileged, and new knowledge gained over time. I think that that's a wonderful, encompassing goal, but I would like to add that I think most of us, myself included, don't know anything about in-depth and nuanced histories of our monuments, even when I was chosen to be on this committee, presumably because I did. Not so. I learned a great deal. Complexity, for sure, in the recognition of layered and evolving narratives representing New York City's public spaces, with preference for additive approaches over subtractive ones. In other words, try not to take things away. Reckoning with power to represent history in public. That sounds like a politically correct phrase. It is. Reckoning with inequity in our collective past, the present, and looking to the future. And I'll have something to say about the evolution of possibly new paradigms and memorials as a result of some other committees that I served on. So we thought a little bit about, okay, so what should we do with these works that had suddenly become the object of controversy? And I do want to underline that controversies are always political, so that commissions like this are always reactive. That's one, and we really need to understand that. They're not organic, the things we discussed. They're in response to something, okay? And the other is that you can remove all the statues in New York and you will not have fixed any of the problems that they are deemed to represent. That said, I think it's important to have these conversations. So we thought about art interventions, new monuments, alternative commemorations, counter-narratives, supplemental education, although nobody's quite sure how to make that happen, since QR codes, I understand, are over. How do we get that public debate out there and public dialogue, such as, you know, something we're beginning to do here? So what we were charged with doing was applying these general guidelines to a few test cases. And this one here was the plaque in what is called the Canyon of Heroes. That was one of the problems. It would better be called something else, but it's what it really is, as you probably all, are you all from New York? Not so much, yes? Okay, great. So as you know, it's a record of the ticker tape parades that we had here. The objection to the Marshal Pétain plaque was that he had committed horrendous, heinous acts during World War II, but this particular parade took place in response to his activities during World War I. So the objections were not pertinent. The other issue that the commission considered was this is a historic record of all the ticker tape parades in New York since they began, so you can't just pull one out. Then what? You're going to take them all out? You know, you would have to really seriously rethink that. The next one, please. Thank you, and thank you, Barry. This is the Dr. Marion Sims, which was on Fifth Avenue opposite the New York Academy of Medicine. And for several reasons, the commission decided to remove this one. The several reasons being, one, it was not designed for this site. Two, the New York Academy of Medicine didn't want it there, and there had been active local objections to the statue for quite some time. So translate that into it didn't have a serious advocate. Okay? It too went to Greenwood Cemetery, where there were some problems encountered. It was too big to fit near Marion Sims' grave. Therefore, it's now in storage. And I understand from the people working there that there actually are local objections to having it even in Greenwood Cemetery, even though he is buried there. One of the things we decided to do, however, was to leave the base. That's a decision I have rethought quite a bit since then, and so had Darren Walker, who was the co-chair of the commission and the head of the Ford Foundation. And I ran into him a couple of months ago, and we both at the same moment said to each other, I think you were right, because he had thought it should go and I had thought it should stay. I now think it should have gone and he now thinks it should stay. So make up your own minds, and maybe you want to share your opinions.
Can you tell us something about the person and why he causes offense?
Yes. But I want to be really careful about this because I'm not a medical historian. Dr. Sims developed a technique he developed a technique to cure a very, very painful condition that some women developed after childbirth. It was a horrific condition. I mean, I've read accounts that said people would have done anything. He did, however, operate without anesthetic, although anesthetic was not widely used at that point in time, on black women who were slaves and needed their owner's permission. I'm not qualified to comment on that entire history. These books have been written, but the main issue was that he was perceived to have been primarily somebody who took advantage of African American slave women. What else he did in terms of the value of what he developed elsewhere, that is a much bigger conversation that somebody else should lead.
Just so that
Oh, sure, sorry.
we know
Why this was
a candidate for removal.
This was, yes, and passionately argued for removal. The Theodore Roosevelt Memorial in front of the Museum of Natural History, as you probably know, it's become the focus of Decolonize This Place and a lot of other things. This was a statue that I was particularly suddenly taken by, because I have to confess I'd never noticed it before. It had disappeared into the general urbanscape, as so much public art does. But I looked at it and I thought, oh, this is a seriously good work of art. Well, it turns out that James Earl Fraser, the artist, was a disciple of Augustus St. Gaudens and had been the chief assistant on the General Sherman that you all know, right, in front of Central Park. So very well trained, very well respected. One of these unusual figures whose history just seems to have disappeared somehow. There is no academic monograph whatsoever. Really was rather startling. Anyway, I started doing a lot of research because I wanted a detailed, nuanced history that didn't exist. And in the process of doing that, I discovered that the architects who would have determined the design for all this, his archives had disappeared, but that's another issue. The Museum of Natural History will be doing an exhibition on it. The commission voted that this should be studied further, and that exhibition will take place as of this moment at the beginning of next year. And because I had already dived into this with kind of monomaniacal focus, I was also asked to write up the art historical history on it. So that was that. And then and the other argument is that this too is part of a larger commission. It's not, the memorial is not just the equestrian monument. So again, I mean, I feel very strongly you can't just pull, pieces of works of art out of their context. The issue of how much the aesthetic quality should matter is something we can talk about. And the last one, which you've already seen several times and which everybody knows was a focus of all kinds of controversy, was the Columbus. And in the end, we took a more pragmatic approach to this. It just became, what we could do if you take this down? Are you going to rename Columbus Avenue Columbia University, the District of Columbia, et cetera? So that is being addressed through, hopefully, monuments and different kinds of recognition for the indigenous communities that were so opposed to having Columbus heroicized. So stay tuned. I'm not sure exactly where that is. What I wanted to kind of focus on next, and maybe I could see the next one, is what seems to me now the emergence of a new kind of paradigm. And it happens to have focused on memorials to women. This is the Boston Women's Monument, which was dedicated already in 2003. It's, for those of you who are familiar with Boston, it's on Commonwealth Avenue. It represents Abigail Adams, Lucy Stone, and Phyllis Wheatley. And I just want to look at this for a second and think about how this changes the way we think about memorials. First of all, it honors more than one person, right? And history is never made alone. I mean, we know this. It spans history, so it's not even a single moment in time. It conveys the notion that history is a process and one person's achievements are built on by somebody else. It also invites people to interact. I was especially moved by somebody who was physically challenged and said, finally, a monument she could get close to, and of course, children. And it's a very different use of the pedestal. Can I have the next? I was also on the selection committee for what will be a memorial by to Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. It will be erected in 2020 to mark the ratification of the 19th Amendment. This design has not yet been approved. This is in process, but the artist has been selected, the same one who did the Boston Memorial. And in general, this is a composition that was approved. Central Park, folks, on Literary Walk, the first actual women to be depicted in Central Park. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton, I'm assuming is familiar, also Susan B. Anthony, who I loved, was arrested for voting in Rochester before the passage of the amendment. You see the scroll that's emerging from Elizabeth Cady Stanton's desk. That will have names and quotes of other important suffragettes: Alice Stone Blackwell, Lucy Chapman Catt, Ida B. Wells, Sojourner Truth, again making the point that history is ongoing, it's a process, and it's ending in the ballot box. It could hardly be more timely, inviting you to vote, and I'm sure we're all going to do that next Tuesday. It conveys a relationship among two women, and it will bring the total number of women depicted in New York City to 7. As opposed to around 150 men. Maybe I should end on that note.
At least we're balanced on this panel. Yeah. So we'll pass to Adrian, who has no images, so we'll leave this up for contemplation and maybe discussion.
Yeah. So I have two primary roles, well, actually 3, involving public sculpture in New York. The first was long ago. I worked under then Parks Commissioner Henry Stern, and I was running something. He developed a very grandiose title, which I know Michele loved, for a job that was overseeing the statues and monuments of New York. I got this job sort of by accident, but I loved it because I was very deeply into historic preservation and learned a lot and had great people to teach me. And he said, we're going to call it the Department of Art and Antiquities. I said, antiquities? He said, and we discovered that, in fact, there were 2 actual antiquities standing in New York City parks. Can anybody name those 2 antiquities? One is obvious. One is the obelisk. What's the other? This is really obscure. I'll buy a coffee if you can name the other antiquity standing in New York Park, including the panel. It's the so-called Column of Jerash. It's a Roman column brought by a Middle Eastern country to the 1964 World's Fair and left there because they didn't want to haul it back. And it stands forlornly in a corner of Flushing Meadows Park, along with the other forgotten artifacts and wretched statues of the various World's Fairs. In my mind, the very best memorial ever erected, because it wasn't really erected, created in a park is Strawberry Fields. You will go to Strawberry Fields and you'll see a memorial to the spirit of John Lennon, and you will not find a statue. And that is why I love it. Because as a landscape, it commemorates the spirit. There is a nod to representational art in the Imagine mosaic, which was actually not part of the original conception. It was not part of the design for the memorial. It was later added, I think it was a gift to the city of Naples. I can't remember. Statues to me, and I oversaw their care, their maintenance when I was the director of art and antiquities, and I'd go to give talks and people would say, you look very young to be the director of art and antiquities. We expected someone older and tweedier. I know I'm tweedier and in fact older. But basically was overseeing about 1,200 historic objects in parks, about 150 of those commemorative sculptures, largely of white European ancestry men. And then lots of other monumental things and monuments. There's all kinds of allegorical sculptures all over. So there are, in fact, lots of women all over New York. They just have names like Memory, Africa, Europe, Freedom, Liberty, and so on and so forth. There are probably as many women as men. They're just not named because they're allegorical. One of the most beautiful women in all of America, and by the way, there are many beautiful women out there, and they are in fact real women. We know their names because we know the names of the models who posed for Augustus St. Gaudens and for Luckman and many of the other sculptors. But one of the most striking, and who was the frequent model of the greatest American sculptor of the 19th century, who am I speaking of? Who do you think I'm speaking of? Augustus St. Gaudens. In my view, Augustus St. Gaudens. The angel leading General Sherman, the statue of Sherman, which you can walk out here and go see, is just a strikingly beautiful sculpture, as is the horse, by the way. In shell shock? Yeah. It's true. She's got this, like, her pupils have disappeared because she's shocked by the sort of awfulness of war. That was, the real woman was Davida Johnson Clark, who was Augustus St. Gaudens's favorite model, also his mistress, mother of his illegitimate child, who lived with him in the Cornish colony in Cornish, New Hampshire. There's all kinds of really juicy history with these artists. Shall we go to Stanford White? But so one of the things I did was try to take care of the monuments. And when I inherited this job, I should tell you, the statues and monuments of New York City, just like its parks, were in dreadful shape. They were corroded. They were full of all kinds. Their patina had been covered over with all kinds of deposits, atmospheric deposits, if they were still there. A number of statues had simply been stolen, cut up, and scrapped to be melted down for bronze. An entire bridge on Riverside Drive, a beautiful bronze bridge, was piece by piece dismantled by vandals in the 1970s. I watched this happen because I lived there. The city did not give a damn about its patrimony or matrimony, whatever you want to call it. Statues were carted away. They were sitting forever in storage areas. They were knocked down. The war memorials of Brooklyn were covered with graffiti. It was an absolute disgrace. We started a program called the Adopt a Monument Program, working in concert with the Municipal Art Society and what was then the Art Commission, now the New York City Public Design Commission. And we got private donors to pay to adopt, to restore these monuments. And we, for instance, got the Grand Marnier Foundation to pay for restoring the monuments of the Marquis de Lafayette. How many monuments of the Marquis de Lafayette are there in New York? Panel? I think at least 3. There are at least 3 statues of the Marquis de Lafayette, including a lovely, lovely one in Union Square. By the way, if you want to see the history of 19th century sculpture, go to Union Square and Madison Square. You can see the whole thing. It's all right there. It's like it's better than buying any textbook on 19th century American sculpture, because some of the very greatest, finest examples and of the evolution of 19th century sculpture are within those 2 public parks. And that reminds me of another anecdote. When I was working, I don't think I was the director of art antiquities. I might have been the parks press secretary working for Henry Stern. And there was a wonderful exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art of the work of Augustus St. Gaudens. And by the way, he's got his, what is the beautiful sculpture well, there are many in Metropolitan Museum. It's got the Latin name. Yes, Kyrie, maybe. Anyway, lots of good Augustus St. Gaudens work in the Metropolitan Museum. So they had this wonderful exhibit, and they wanted to borrow the statue of Admiral Farragut, which stands today in Madison Square Park. And they borrowed it, and they said, well, now that we have it, you're not really good at taking care of your public sculptures, so why don't we just keep it, and we'll give you a very nice copy you could put back in Madison Square. And to his everlasting credit, Henry Stern said, nuts. You're not keeping our statue. Give it back. We'll take care of it ourselves. Thank you very much. Thankfully, he did that, so it's still standing there. But that was a really interesting battle. He just said, sorry, you can't keep our sculpture. Public sculpture is incredibly problematic. Who commissions it? And the vast majority, almost 100%, I think civic virtue is an exception. There may be some more that you know about, were not commissioned or paid for by the city. That's a very important thing to understand. They were commissioned and paid for through what they called public subscription. That is, people said, often immigrant groups or people who cared about veterans said, we want to erect a sculpture to symbolize our great culture, whatever that might be. And in many cases, it was immigrant groups. So Columbus, and there are sculptures of Danes and Swedes. You can kind of see the progress of immigrants through New York, through the sculptures. It's only in this very recent batch, I think the 2 monuments to the Women's Central Park are they being paid for privately? There's a commission for commissioning monuments. Yeah, okay. But there's another where they want to commission, the city has just said they're going to pay to commission monuments to women. City funded, yeah. Which is breaking with tradition. You can go either way. My argument against traditional sculpture now is you may disagree with me on this, some may disagree. The problem now is that we don't have really good sculptors anymore. We had magnificent sculptors who could work in the representational tradition in the 19th century and the early 20th century. It's really difficult. There are some, but it's really difficult to find a good representational sculpture. I travel around the country now, my job at the Trust for Public Land. I visit parks, and the parks are full of sculpture. There is a lot of execrable sculpture out there, increasingly. We are in a new era of putting up public sculpture, and it is terrible. It is awful. It's like, did you not pass Anatomy 101? You want to say to people, they're scary. They're like monster sculptures, and that's the best ones. So it's like, please don't put up any more sculptures because they're scary. They do not look like human beings. Now, there's some very good artists. I really like the representation of Eleanor Roosevelt, which was one of the very first statues of women to go up. I worked very much on that. I worked on the sculpture of the monument to Duke Ellington. Controversial. Duke Ellington, great musician, but he stands at a piano supported by 3 columns, and the 3 columns each have 3 very finely detailed naked young girls supporting him. So there was this moment where the borough president of Manhattan, Ruth Messenger, had to decide, do I go this side or that side? Because I'm going to be against Duke Ellington, or for feminism, against feminism, for Duke Ellington. She finally went with, I guess I support this monument. So that was a really interesting moment. Final point. The argument that we should get, there was this nickname for this mayoral commission, the symbols of hate, they called it. Right, you shouldn't have symbols of hate. I believe that most of the so-called Confederate monuments in the South were put in the 1920s specifically to be symbols of racial repression and white supremacy. And it even says that on some of them. This is a symbol of white supremacy. They should be taken down, no question. It gets really tricky when you start to look at the personal issues of people. So you say, we have to remove Marion Sims because he, quote unquote, experimented on slaves. There's arguments on both sides. Should we have statues of war criminals, people who called for the murder of civilians and prisoners of war? Does anybody think we should have those? Anyway, I'm not going to have a poll. We have one. It's a statue of Simón Bolívar. Simón Bolívar, as he was liberating South American countries from Spain, had a decree. The decree was guerra a muerte, meaning war to the death. That is, you are free to murder anybody born in Spain or all prisoners of war, and they did that. So one of the great war criminals of history has a giant statue on 59th Street. Should we take it down because he was a murderer? It's beyond me. Anyway, some thoughts.
There's a lot to discuss. I'm sorry we've maybe shaved our discussion time quite a bit, but I think we've got a lot of very interesting material and interesting perspectives. I'm just going to throw out one question and then ask if any of the panelists have others after we have talked about that for a bit, but I hope that we'll have a few minutes for anything that might be coming up with you in Q&A. So you want to go directly to Q&A? You think so? Okay, we can do that. I'll just put my question out there, and maybe someone would want to formulate it, because I think very interestingly with all of your remarks, we have the question of, you brought up the comment of shared values, I think, and we have seen in simply our presentations that how do you reconcile the shared values of, say, artistic excellence and importance, the what is actually commemorated? So what happens when you have a monument that commemorates something that is now being reevaluated, that is an excellent work of art, or what happens when you have the opposite? So I throw that one out there while you warm up with your questions.
I kind of have a response. I mean, having served on the Public Design Commission, which has to approve these sorts of things, and also worked on the histories of these sometimes, now contentious monuments, I think it's a real problem. I mean, once you start talking about removing the problematic subjects or the problematic monuments, everyone is going, everyone being proposed for commemoration is going to be a problem in some way to someone or another. So the Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton came up for criticism by Brent Staples of the New York Times because I believe he was arguing that Stanton, her attitude about suffrage was limited to whites, and so there was sort of an inherent racist bias about the nature of suffragism. So the point is simply that either, if we maintain the attitudes we have now, I think that ultimately there are not going to be possible permanent public monuments, and the way in which art review, for example, is built into the city charter, the assumption is that once the work is approved for city property, it is a permanent work. It doesn't go away because some 20 years down the line or 100 years down the line, somebody doesn't like it. So you either have, it may be necessary only if the city is going to maintain its involvement with public monuments to only commission temporary monuments, have many women being commemorated over time or something along those lines. But the idea of having something permanent that's going to please everybody, I don't think it's going to be possible anymore.
So let me just add 3 very quick things. I think one of the dangers that we face at this moment is having an exclusively presentist lens. Obviously, we see things through our own values, which is fine. Every age has done that, but when we do that to the exclusion of history, we're doing everybody a disservice. The second point that I want to make is, as far as I know, there is no public art agency in the country that has a de-accession policy, even to this date. I did, in another mad moment, I did a book on the Tilted Art controversy, wherein some of you may remember that, where I investigated that. And the third point is the She Built New York committee, which I was also on recently, presented the city with 5 choices based on public input for commemorating a woman, actually women in this case, and not a single recommendation was for a single statue. So that's a little bit what I was referring to before. If we see a paradigm shift in memorials, maybe this conversation will become a little easier.
Yes, it is interesting, the concept that the famous public cemeteries that were often thought of, or private, or these great cemeteries that in some ways are forerunners of the public parks, are now receiving the odd assignment of being the graveyard of that which we're not supposed to visit, because in fact they were not only visited to commemorate a loved one who might be there, but they were in the 19th and 20th century very beautifully situated, like Greenwood, places of public memory, a park space, and the like. So this notion that they might become the place where you can try to bury the memory of a monument that at some point became upsetting, and somehow deal with the problem that way, also seems relatively naive. So we have questions. I'll be the roving mic. Oh, you've got one. Okay, Linda has one.
I'd like to just throw in another thought. Even in the cemeteries, even after death, controversy doesn't go away. I was just in Atlanta, Georgia, and went to the equivalent of Greenwood, which is Oakland Cemetery. Beautiful cemetery, public cemetery, now cared for by Conservancy. And there's a really interesting moment there. You have at the base of the hill a giant column for the Confederacy, and then a bunch of graves of Confederate soldiers. Just up the hill is something known as Slave Square, where slaves were buried and then exhumed so that white bodies could be moved in to fill. There's something very different. I asked the question of the curator, I said, what do you do about this issue? You've got this nice interpretive signage talking about there used to be slaves buried here, but we drove them out after they're dead so white people could be buried, and we've got a Confederate monument where there used to be Slave Square. It's a big issue. What do you say? Okay to have the Confederate soldiers' graves because they were probably conscripted to fight for something they may not have known what they're fighting for and died painfully. But should that obelisk, symbol of white supremacy, be standing there a few feet from where enslaved people used to be buried? So even in the cemeteries, even after death, the issue continues.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It was wonderful. I'm just curious with this question of there's the controversy, and then as we've just discussed, where does it go if you need to remove it, if you need to recontextualize it? And if it is becoming so many of them, why not, have there been any talks about having a larger public space specifically dedicated to this, specifically dedicated to not going to a cemetery, but to a place where the context will be simultaneous with the work, a public space where it is recognized this is where the works go that we now need to have discussions about?
There is a place, I wish I could remember where in Europe, maybe one of you knows, Budapest, thank you, where the sculptures are kind of put out to die. They're not conserved, they're not, maintained in any way, but they are there, and it's felt that this is a kind of organic approach. Somebody asked me to make some comment on exactly this question for some blog or another, and I rather facetiously discussed maybe we should have a museum dedicated to this, which is, I think, what you're saying, but who's going to fund that?
No curator wants to have these things moved into the museum. It's
into an existing.
It's not. I mean, it's just not pragmatic. It's not feasible. It ain't going to happen.
It reminds me, there was I think a child's book or something, The Graveyard of Unwanted Toys. That's kind of what it's reminding me about. It's a really difficult issue. And if you want to see forgotten monuments, not really monuments, it's sculptures, just go to Flushing Meadows Park. There were these things created for the various World's Fairs that kind of sit there in obscurity, places where there used to be, the pavilions of various countries that have nothing to do with anything anymore. So we've got plenty of forgotten, obscure monuments across the city.
Yeah.
With your extensive involvement with the subject matter of public sculpture, have you seen any instance of public sculpture like the ones we have here in New York City being used for an educational purpose? Have you ever heard of a class being taken to Grant's tomb to talk about Grant, or to talk about Sherman or Sheridan or the World War I doughboys? Is that educational role evident at all, or has it completely?
It has been, I know for a fact that it has been incorporated into various school curricula. I was asked to speak to a 4th grade class at a Brooklyn private school about this. They'd been studying various sculptures in their neighborhood. I think it was Packer. The kids were so they're 10. They were amazingly receptive. They didn't have any problems with anything. And I think that's the way to start. There's an anthology in the works called Teachable Monuments, which will include a number of examples from an international focus. I think it's being published by Bloomsbury. I should know this because I'm writing the epilogue, but I don't at the moment recall. But anyway, there will be a circulation, and this conversation will be expanded. It's a really good point.
I teach about monument history every semester to undergraduates. I mean, they're not high school kids. But I've also argued very strenuously that that is the role that we need to play today, that the school kids have to be brought out to the site, and they learn not just about the subject of the work, they can actually learn about what a bronze sculpture is and how it's made, and what is the relationship of the work to its site, how is site important, what does that mean, landscape design. So there are all sorts of things that kids can learn. I gather it's difficult to bring public school kids out to to do field trips, so there are logistical issues. But yeah, it's absolutely crucial.
I just want to quickly address that. Obviously, President Grant's tomb is highly visited. It's a National Historic Site. I will point out, I was just in Atlanta. The Martin Luther King National Historic Site and Park is extraordinarily moving. I was there. They have his birth home. They have the Ebenezer Baptist Church. They have a museum. But the most powerful things there are not sculptures of Dr. King. They're his home preserved exactly as it would have been as he was growing up as a child, and the church in which his father and grandfather preached for 50 years, and he also served as a co-parson. One of the most moving things I've ever participated in, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of school kids going through it. So that's an example of a wonderful, well-created, well-run memorial to somebody. Obviously a very important figure, worthy of all of that, and not just a statue, but so good and so visited and so teaching.
Yes. I love that we're taking the conversation in the direction of education of children, of what's possible and what's not possible, and dealing with the present, right? So as human beings, we're only going to be able to affect what we can in our lifetime, and our children are going to be modeled and inherit what we leave behind. And I think that if the intention is such that we are looking at these statues as human beings, people that are perfect in some ways and very flawed in others, like, why is it so difficult to just address both things when you have a statue up, so that the person that's seeing it, a young child, like I'm raising little boys, twin boys that are 6, can take in the humanity of the person, that they've done some bad and they've done some good. You know, Harvey Weinstein is, you know, very controversial, done a lot of bad things, also green-lighted a lot of really amazing projects and films. So just, is that difficult? Is that being considered?
I would like to know why it's that difficult, because I have encountered resistance in very many places, in particular when I've spoken about the Teddy Roosevelt Memorial, but when I spoke to the 10-year-olds, they were fine. It wasn't a problem. So I don't know when we've become so tunnel visioned.
Yeah, when I was Parks Commissioner, this issue of the Dr. Marion Sims statue came up, and at the time we said we're going to put explanatory text there that explains the pros and the cons. That never happened. I think had we done that, the issue would have been resolved.
It got started. The effort got started, and then for a variety of reasons, it shifted. And Charlottesville didn't help on that. But absolutely.
Hello. I'm a visitor from overseas, so you'll have to excuse my not perfect English, please. And I come from Germany, and I exhibit here. And as you all are aware, of course, we have quite a problem with our not so long ago history in Germany, and it very well blends in, of course, with what you're discussing. And there is a big discussion, an ongoing discussion about street names, and it's quite amusing to watch it in one way, and it's in a way metaphoric for what I'm trying to say, because street names, I mean, the Adolf Hitler Street went straight away, and a few Goering streets and whatever, but all the people in society that were in the Nazi Party or that were sponsoring it, of course, also had street names. And so you have, within the society, you have street names all over. Had they all been identified in 1945, we would have lost it. You would have lost orientation in a city. And that is amusing in a way, because it would be metaphoric for, if you irradiate all your historic tradition, you're lost. And in a way, I don't think that in Germany, for example, where everybody believes and has worked hard on not to forget the Nazi era, would it have helped to sort of get rid of all the names, all the street names? I doubt it. So I think it does need, in the end, it needs education and it needs tolerance, but it is also interesting to see that the country you come from and its heritage is not all positive, but it is in parts controversial. And the same is true for this country and for issues like slavery, but I don't think it'll help us at all to tear all these monuments down. I don't see that. But the way we deal with them is the important thing. And there I think, the issue of education really comes in.
I think we're almost out of time, but I think that your remarks, first of all, remind us that this is not uniquely, even at this moment, a problem of the United States, that many countries need to grapple with difficult moments in the past. And I think Michele pointed to, from my view, of a very important notion, which is to remember that taking the statue away doesn't take the issue away. And in fact, one could even, I think, put forth, perhaps controversially, the notion that the removal is some kind of naive way of believing that you can not grapple with the issue. And in a certain way, the presence might make it easier in educational terms and the like. Now, of course, there's a sliding scale and there's case by case, but the notion of removing all signs of something and not dealing with the issue or not having it as an ongoing involvement with the complexity of the way our society and culture has evolved, to me seems such a flattening of the history of this country, both its strifes and things that have been left behind.
And I just want to add to that, especially in response to what you were saying is, and I agree with you, but that what we're dealing with here also are physical objects, and they have unique properties that play out psychologically, physically, historically in a lot of different and complex ways. And one of the problems is that the way in which they're being dealt with is as sort of almost like street names, like flattened out abstractions that don't have that physicality that art historians, certainly people working in the public landscape realm, are very conscious of. And that's something that I have hoped would be brought back into the conversation, the physicality and its impact, for better or, for positive and negative.
Yeah, and as I visited Berlin, of course, lots of history there. When I was in Berlin, the wall was still up and it was still divided. But what I was struck by was visiting the Olympic Park and the Olympic stadiums and the sculpture that were all built in 1936 as Nazism was beginning to crescendo. And I was actually grateful for the fact that it had not been torn down, so that you could see and learn from and see how the Aryan ideal was being represented in the sculptures of the Aryan youth and stuff like that. It could easily have been torn down as a representation of the birth of fascism, but it wasn't. And I was grateful for the fact that it still stood there, and I could see the physical manifestation of the Third Reich and its aspirations in this architecture.
I fear I have to cut this short. We know we're just a fragment in the very fast-flowing river of events and debates, but we hope we've synthesized some of the issues for you. I don't know if you're going to find any controversial monuments for sale out at the booths, but in any case, and thanks to Linda for inviting us and for bringing together, I think, a superb panel of people to open up these issues for you.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you all again for coming. I want to remind you again that this has been live streamed, that it's available, that you can go back and look, and you can sort of possibly tease out some of these issues and think a little bit more about them, and possibly discuss them over dinner. or with friends, because this is a topic that is not going to go away, clearly. And that's one of the reasons we wanted to present it, and I hope we'll have a chance to have an ongoing conversation about this in the cultural program. So thank you once again, and another great hand for our wonderful panel. Thank you.